Okay, we are in Exodus 25 again this week, and we'll be reading from verse 10 through verse 22, discussing the Ark of the Covenant, and then we'll see where we go from there. Verse 10 of Exodus chapter 25. They shall construct an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, and 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. You shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and out you shall overlay it, and you shall make a gold molding around it. You shall cast 4 gold rings for it, and fasten them on its 4 feet. And 2 rings shall be on one side, and 2 rings on the other side of it. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry the ark with them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be removed from it. You shall put into the ark the testimony which I shall give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, and make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other end, and you shall make the cherub of one piece with the mercy seat at its 2 ends. The cherubim shall have their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat with their wings, facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony which I shall give you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, which are upon the ark of the testimony, I will speak to you about all that I will give you in commandment for the sons of Israel. Okay, what do we think about that?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me when I was earlier, the poles are to remain in the rings of the ark. They are not to be removed. And lo and behold, they were carrying it on a cart without the ring, the poles in the rings, and trouble.
Okay.
When you reached out to steady it, keep it from falling.
Oh, so yes.
Yeah. Well, they got something right in the movie, huh? Oh, yeah.
Some movies of biblical subjects are more accurate than others, and they, I think, a lot of them try to be faithful, but they're also trying to make a movie that's entertaining and accessible to non-biblical scholars. So it's a you know a little bit of a hit and miss thing sometimes. There was an animated movie, Prince of Egypt, a long time ago, and I may have a very different opinion if I see it now because I only saw it once shortly after it came on home video. But I thought at the time it did a pretty good job. I thought it was pretty accurate. Um, some of the other maybe uh, treatments aren't as faithful to the text. So, any other thoughts about the Ark of the Covenant?
Very elaborate, gold plated, and this and that.
Yes. Does it seem kind of odd that they're shaping items to look like something? Dahlia says yes. And why is that? Well, I think it's a fair interpretation. It certainly is a little bit of a challenge to reconcile with the commandment against making graven images of things above, things in heaven, or things on earth. Now, this is a commandment that is specifically given by God to make these things. It might be. Evidently, it didn't lead to a lot of other. Certainly, they had idolatry and would have false gods, but not within their Hebrew worship. There wasn't a lot of. We'll get into it. Even with the lampstand, the menorah. Later on, the table is pretty nondescript. It's very functional more than it is ornate. But the lampstand is very ornate as well and looks like an almond tree. So it's a little bit of a perhaps challenge to reconcile with the two, because the Ten Commandments, that's like the source, isn't it? That's like the number one. That's, if it gets in the Ten Commandments, that's what you start with. And here they come along and say, make these angels basically cherubim, and make two of them and make them face together, and this is going to be the mercy seat. If you want to look up, there's some really good renditions, artistic renditions of all of these things online. They try to be pretty faithful. There's still some variation. The wings turned upward. So you see, sometimes you'll see the wings curved upward, and it looks like that would not be a very comfortable mercy seat. But most of the time, it's kind of shown they're going straight across the middle. So it's it's and even the term mercy seat. Sometimes it's called atoning cover, and that may be a little bit better use or understanding of the word. Just as the word ark here, it's a different word for ark that's used here than is used for ark in terms of Noah's ark. So, I mean, this is a very small, compared to Noah's ark, it's a very small vessel, and still probably big enough and heavy enough that you needed some labor to move anyway. And of course, it's all set up a certain way by God. So, um, a lot of commandments. Um, it does, I think, um, it gets blurred. The history of the ark gets blurred a little bit. It's supposed to not be an object of worship. It's supposed to be something that enables them to worship the true and living God. That's its intent. But whenever you have this tangible thing, and it's going to be a beautiful thing, and it is so prominent in the worship context, there's always going to be the danger, I think, of some people idolizing it, some people making it an object of worship, something that they don't just use to worship the true and living God, something they worship in and of themselves. Um, I think if you go into other groups, I'm not going to name any specifically, but if you go into their buildings, you may see a lot of ornate decoration designed to, at some level, um, I think originally at least, uh, to promote worship, to facilitate worship, to help people be take their minds and their hearts in the right place, to set the tone for the gathering. And at some point, those objects take a greater place in their heart than that. There's that danger of it, at least. It's nothing new, really. I think we can see it here. And in the earliest days of the church, there was a big market, like a black market, going crazy for relics. And these were low items, pieces of wood from the cross, St. John's big toe, and the churches all wanted this stuff in their gathering place. In there, they wanted these relics, and it's something kind of maybe that does borderline on idolatry. And Israel is an idolatrous people at this point still. I think that's something that is very much just underneath the surface. There, we're going to get a couple of chapters. They're worshiping a golden calf, and then they struggle with idolatry all along. And I think this is a place where God is giving Israel something that they at least think they need, which is a tangible object to focus on while they worship. And the problem, of course, is becoming it is what they're worshiping. And it shows, the whole point, God says, I'm going to meet you here. So this is a place where God comes into contact with, in a sense, the nation of Israel through its, normally just through its most sanctified representative, the high priest. It's not, I don't know how else to say it. He is sanctified and set aside for that purpose. So it doesn't make him a morally better person or anything like that, but that's his job. So it's an interesting thing, how they viewed it, how they used it. Of course, it's had a lot of cultural impact. I'm gonna mention the one very classic movie, where we find out that Moses' last name is Heston. You didn't know that, did you? He actually went to Northwestern University in Chicago. It's really interesting. Played football there. But and there's another one that we kind of joked about a little bit last week with the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that's a little more recent. They're both getting pretty old. I bet my guess is it's longer since Raiders of the Lost Ark till now between the Ten Commandments and Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm not sure about that, but it's got to be pretty close. It's Raiders of the Lost Ark came out in 1981, so it's 42 years old. If you hadn't been feeling old enough lately, that's one of those. I preached a sermon in 2015. The movie Back to the Future, remember that movie? He was in 1985 and he went back to 1955 because that's like ancient history to him. Well, in 2015, we were 30 years from the Back to the Future. We were as far from them as he was from his parents. So it's time gets away from us sometimes, but it is this accommodation of Israel's idolatrous nature without hopefully it becoming an idol itself. But God is meeting Israel. They need, I think, a physical, tangible object, even though they're not supposed to touch it. It's tangible. It's there. Somebody touched it because somebody had to build it. So they put their hands on it. They made it. And it's something they know that it's there. They can sense it clearly. And that's, it's something today, I think, especially in our practices and the way we worship, we kind of frown upon. And I think there is a reason to be cautious when you have these types of ornate, sacred things. It certainly was sacred to Israel. That they can become significant in their own. And yet, that doesn't mean that people who feel a need for something visible and tangible to get them in a better place for worship, that they're weak or they're wrong or they don't really need it. That's, I think, our big criticism is that we say, well, you don't really need that. When there's some tradition we don't like, say, well, you don't really need it. You just think you need it. Well, we don't need it, maybe. But maybe they do need it. And maybe it is helpful. We've talked about the works of art in a lot of like ancient, like medieval churches in Europe, and you go there and there's just these beautiful works of art. To a congregation that's illiterate, that can't read for themselves, and it has no access to the Bible because it's just not around. That's the closest thing they get to reading the Bible themselves. So I think we can do what we do without condemning what other people do. And I would say that's true of a lot of things. Yes, sir.
Well, I just was going to point out, even the high priest became something that wasn't originally planned. He became more worship, more worshipped, I guess, or looked up to than what it was originally planned. There was many things that were set up to begin with one intention, and because they were tangible and they could be seen, it just led to other issues.
Well, you have Moses going before the presence of the Lord, and
Right.
he'd come home and his face would shine because he'd been in the presence of the Lord, and he would cover his face so that they wouldn't see the shine wearing off,
Right.
basically.
Right.
And that's that's they don't want to see. God doesn't want Israel seeing Moses kind of diminished. And God has said, "I will make you like God to Pharaoh." You know, Moses, you're going to be like God to Pharaoh. And we talked about how when you see what Moses does and you say, well, God is doing this or Moses is doing that, God's doing it through Moses, it's kind of all the same thing. And that was God's intent. He wanted them to follow Moses so strongly that if that line got blurred in their minds, it's not blurred in reality, but if it's blurred in their minds, that's okay. And with this worship and the elements of it, God is trying to create a culture within Israel. And if lines get blurred along the way of them becoming a very distinctive people, that's okay too. But this is one of those little passages when we talk about God hating idolatry. And I'm not saying he doesn't hate idolatry, but I'm saying that God can accommodate human weakness. And if God cannot accommodate human weakness, then we can't have a relationship with him because we're always going to be weak. And if he can't put up with that, then we can't be in his presence. And God makes this accommodation. So, and I don't see a whole lot of it here, and I'm not trying to advocate it, and I'm not trying to um, denigrate it either way. But like if somebody wears a cross because it helps remind them that they're a Christian,
And
yeah.
it's always been our tradition that you should be wearing a cross. You should be some form of the open grave.
Well, I mean, we can't just live at the open grave though either, can we? Because life's not just a moment of intense joy. Life is a lot of suffering. And so you have to really go back and forth between the open grave and back to the cross. And I would just say also, like I said, I'm not advocating it, but if someone else, it helps them remember they're a Christian, live like a Christian. Um, it's again, we don't have to condemn it. We may not practice it ourselves, but we don't have to condemn it. We shouldn't, I don't think, try to tell people they don't need things that they feel like they need when we don't know who they are, we don't know where they're at, we don't know what their background is. And it's the cross is really the center of the gospel. It's maybe, I mean, the two things really you can't, one gives significance to the open grave isn't that as significant if you didn't know he died on a cross. And the cross isn't that powerful if he doesn't rise on the third day. So they kind of do go together. But Paul says we preach Christ crucified. So you can't run away from the cross. And yet, do people sometimes worship a cross? I don't know. Is it facilitating their worship and rather than being worshipped in and of itself? Uh, I guess we can just let God, who looks at their heart and knows exactly what's going on in their heart, make that judgment. We don't really. I would suggest we don't have to make that determination, and that's. Um, I think a contemporary Christian parallel to the Old Testament practice that it's not a, a total weakness to need something tangible. If it is, then humans have always been weak because they've always needed it. That doesn't mean that they can't get it out of proportion and that that's not a bad thing too. It's not just Uzzah touching the ark, which is bad enough. I mean, certainly. And I think, we can, in our view on this side of the cross, we can look at Uzzah's mistake and say, that doesn't mean he was in hell for all eternity either, does it? It just means he died. He received this is what was happening, and that God used the Uzzah account to make an impression on who was ordering the movement of the ark? David. Now, David plays a little fast and loose with the laws sometimes, but he's a man after God's own heart, and he is joyful that the ark is there, and the ark is going to be going where David wants it to be. They did get the ark kind of out of priority. They misunderstood it at times. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, I don't have this in your handout, but in 1 Samuel chapter 4, they're getting their rear ends kicked by the Philistines, so they go get the ark and think we'll take it into battle, and we've got the ark. No army can withstand an army with the ark. They did withstand it. They took the ark back to the people, back into their town, back into their village. And it doesn't go well for the Philistines once they have it. But it's at the very end of the life of I guess you could say the second to the last judge, which is Eli. And it's a great defeat, and it's a real shame for Israel to lose the ark, because the ark is the glory of the Lord. And so when Eli's daughter-in-law is giving birth, and they find out that they've lost the ark, and it just makes Eli keel over dead, basically, and the child that is born at the time is named Ichabod. Ichabod is the glory of the Lord. Ichabod is no glory. We've lost the glory of the Lord. You see, so these old writers of fiction, the guy, I think, was it Nathaniel Hawthorne that wrote Sleepy Hollow? Ichabod Crane. Uh, I'm really struggling. I can't remember his name now. The guy who wrote Scrooge and all that. Dickens. Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer, Stone of Help. And is Scrooge presented as a helpful person throughout most of the story? No. They knew their Bible, those old guys. I mean, they did. And they picked those characters, they picked that name. Ichabod Crane's a kind of a doofus, a loser. He does nothing nothing great about Ichabod. He doesn't have any glory. So they misunderstood the ark, the chest, whatever you want to call it. This mercy seat would be sprinkled with blood on the Day of Atonement. It's also, and I think maybe more accurately translated, the cover of propitiation. It's kind of word salad a little bit, perhaps. Which word is this or that? But we talked about that a long time ago, about God's need for propitiation and how that's really difficult for a lot of contemporary Christians to think, because it sounds like, well, God needs an atoning sacrifice because he's offended, and God can't just get over it. And that's our hang up. That is not a hang up our ancestors had at all. That God needs an atoning sacrifice for sin. So a propitiation, a cover of propitiation, it doesn't just cover the contents of the ark. It doesn't just cover the stone tablets placed therein. It covers the sin of Israel when sprinkled with the atoning sacrifice's blood. Yes, sir.
I don't know how far down that road you want to go, but that's interesting that, and you may have been taking a little bit of liberty when you said that God get over it. How can they not understand Christ is our atoning sacrifice?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at the sacrifice of Jesus. It is the atoning propitiation for our sins. Of course, God provided that himself. It's also the means by which God can identify with our suffering as a whole. It does not just take away our sins. It says, whatever you're going through in life, God has endured. God has suffered. And because of that, it puts him in a position of righteous judgment. If you're totally detached from some problem that someone else has, you can't identify with it. You can't. When I first got out of law school, I was 24 years old. I had led a very sheltered life. My first client that came to see me was an elderly gentleman who was in a very desperate strait financially, and he's crying at my table, like a 65-year-old man just crying at my desk. I didn't know what to do. I'd gone to law school, taken the bar exam, I'd done all that stuff. I clerked, I had never dealt with a client who felt like their life was hanging in the balance. A grown person, a grown adult looking to me to help them with their big problem. Uh, Once you have faced some of those big problems yourselves, once you've had stress like that, difficulties like that, then you can really understand and compose yourself and deal with it a little bit better. Uh, if God has not been tempted, and as we're told, he doesn't even get tempted by sin, how can he identify with our suffering, which is all born of sin? Well, Jesus endured it. God watched his son die on a cross, and that's a whole different, brings up a lot of other issues. And all of these in the more contemporary way of looking at things and what Jesus really is. But, we have this notion that is ours of God, of who he is. And basically, he's like a big grandpa who just pays off our credit card bill and just does nice things all the time. He just spoils us all the time. And and there's that aspect to it. I mean, it's not like he doesn't bless us. It's not like he doesn't forgive us. It's not like he doesn't take care of us. But our ancestors had no problem with a God that was angry. In fact, maybe they were a little too comfortable with it. And you just never find, this is the human journey. There's a balance, but we go right past it in each direction constantly. And so the idea that God needing a propitiating sacrifice, it's established kind of early on. It's established in a sense with Abraham. Now, he had to have a sacrifice, and the Lord provided the sacrifice. So it is. I think mercy is certainly it's a fair translation, and they're coming here. It's not an unfair, I think, translation or concept or way of understanding it. I think a propitiation cover might be a little more accurate, that it's more about covering the sins of Israel so God can be with them. And mercy in and of itself does not require necessarily, I guess, a propitiation. It just finds that you have to have it in your heart to forgive. You just give it out anyway. But, and it's not that God's love is conditional, but God is righteous. God ultimately has to have these sacrifices, and it's not our leading image of God, our primary image of God, but it's a true part of God's nature. Yes, sir.
Well, sorry, but you brought up that this is a covering of the sin. And we find in the New Testament that his blood washes away our sins. These sins weren't done away with, they were covered.
Well, you can cover a multitude of sins too. The leading your brother back from error covers a multitude of sins. So it's kind of symbolic and a way of looking at things. And none of this ultimately precludes the need for Christ, and that's Paul's conclusion in Galatians. If we could be righteous through the law, then Jesus didn't need to die. We just needed to be better people. But we're not ever going to be good enough as people. No law is going to be adequate. No keeping of our law is going to be good enough to really make us righteous. We're always going to need forgiveness. We're always going to need mercy. It's the stuff of life, especially with a life lived with God. You can never be a good enough person, no matter how obedient you are. And there's some good people in here, and I'm not going to name any names, because if I did name everybody, then people get their feelings hurt. But there are some really good people in here. But the best of us need God's mercy just as much as the worst of us needs it. And I would say maybe the best of us are the ones who realize that and are transformed by that in how we interact with other people. If we look at someone and we don't like what they're doing, we can maybe remember that God doesn't like some of the things we do. And he abides with us anyway through the blood of Jesus Christ. And maybe if God can put up with us, we can put up with them. Maybe not. Any other thoughts? And we'll close this out on the ark. I think they saw it when they moved it. They weren't allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. The presence of the Lord was on it, but the ark would be moved, and it would be moved openly. So it was, David's out dancing in front of it, and his wife, "Why are you doing that? You look like a fool." How many times Sherry tells me I look like, and when she does, she's right. Anyway, but and that's it for her. She's cloistered after that. Adios. The thing about David is when it came to wives, he had options. He wasn't. There was always some competition there among the wives. So. Yeah, it's they saw it at times, and I think the rarity of seeing it was some of the mystical quality of it, if you will. They didn't see it very often, but they brought it out, and it's kind of like Notre Dame in their green uniforms. Whenever they come out, they wear their green uniforms. You're like, oh no, now they're really going to play hard. So, and it's really funny when they get beat wearing their green uniforms, but that's a different matter. So, any other thoughts? Good questions. Good comments. Okay. We should, I think, finish it up, chapter 25 up next week. I think we can do the table and the lampstand both. The table especially is not particularly symbolic or ornate, and there's no it seems to be really a very practical item rather than a richly theological one. So we'll see. Thank you for your attention and your